Okay. Dr. James Fadiman will be speaking next. The topic is microdosing, what we've learned, and why it matters. Dr. Fadiman and Robert Frager co-founded the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, now known as Sophia University, in 1975. Dr. Fadiman was a president of the Association for Transpersonal Psychology. He was also a director at the Institute of Noetic Sciences from 1975 to 77. James has been associated with psychedelics since the early 1960s, when introduced to them by Richard Alpert Ram Dass in Paris in 1962. A selection of James' books include The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, Safe, Therapeutic, and Sacred Journeys, Be Love Now with Rameshwar Das, Personality and Personal Growth, 7th edition, with Robert Frager, The Other Side of Hate, a novel, and that's H-A-I-G-H-T, and Essential Sufism to round it out. So with no further ado, let's welcome Dr. James Fadiman. Thank you.
All right. Drugs first. I once woke Tim Leary up from a nap, and he woke up and he said, if the government ever discovers how good sleep is, they're going to outlaw it. I think that way around about water. And as I was listening to the end of Rachel's talk, I finally had an answer to a question about the ayahuasca world. And it's a question which is, in the LSD world and the psilocybin world and in some of the obscure drugs that only some of you have taken, there's a saying, it's from, I think, Albert Camus, which says, if you ask God a question, after he answers you, you hang up the phone. But nobody ever hangs up the phone with ayahuasca. And I finally got it, which is, since ayahuasca is Mother Nature, whoever hangs up the phone on nature? You know, when have you said, okay, it's enough nature? You know, no more sunsets. I've really had enough. So, I alone am giving you a talk with a different title. But 95% of the talk fits the other title that you have, so you won't know the difference. But I'd like to tell you what the other title was, because it's the first couple of minutes, and it's called Microdosing, the New Psychedelic Frontier. And that's supposed to be farther out and more radical than what we've learned, which is kind of, what did you do last summer? Well, I took 2CB in Nepal. Because what's happened all day, and what happens in most of what we talk about with psychedelics, is high doses. And it's certainly what I've been involved in since the 60s. And in an irony that only Mother Nature could pull, having spent my entire career deeply committed to high doses, meaning 400 micrograms of LSD and up. I mean, if you're not transcending this universe, you're not, doing much. And what do I get? What does God ask me to do next? Microdoses that have one fundamental definition: no psychedelic effects. However, they're made of psychedelics, and that kind of allows me in, because microdoses have certain essential differences. As well, can I have some house lights so I can see you a little better? Well, you'll just have to wave your arms. How many of you have not had a major psychedelic experience? Not had? Okay, I'm good. There's some of you. Thank you. How many of you have not microdosed? All right. God, I wish I was selling it. Well, Microdosing have none of the mind-blowing experiences. No transformations, no becoming all beings, no going beyond all being, no snakes that swallow you, no dismemberment, no demons, no angelic beings, not even ancestors. Microdosing is new dose levels, new methods, new effects, and new implications. The dose level for a microdose is between 1/10 and 1/20 of a recreational dose, not a knock your socks off and forget you've ever worn socks dose, but just a recreational dose. That's about 7 to 12 micrograms, 0.1 to 0.4 dried mushroom powder, and so on, or less. What we found is from a couple of thousand people who've written us about their experiences that many more people say, well, 10 was a little too much. I'm now doing 7 or 6, and so forth. Very few people say 10 wasn't enough. And there's also always the people that say 10 was really good, so 20 was obviously going to be better, and I screwed up. Frequency. Now this is again a distinction in high dose, which is when you have a high dose of serious psychedelics, you need time to integrate, to filter out what's you, what's the drug, what's the situation, and basically to digest. If you think of those pictures of snakes that like eat a goat, you can't eat a goat the next day. But if you're just having like a sandwich, so the frequency of almost all the results I'm going to talk to you tonight is taking it 1 day on and 2 days off. Now, some of you, since you're up here and you know and love Paul Stamets, he has a different notion, which is 5 days on and 2 days off. And I've talked to Paul about it, and I said, honestly, Paul, it just looks like pretty much probably we're getting the same results for people, but you're more generous with mushrooms because you have access to more mushrooms. And he looked at me and smiled. And the other thing is, one of our early discoveries is for many people, a microdoses is a 2-day event. And a lot of people have written me and said, second day is better. Now with Paul's system, you only have a second day once a week. So that's really suggests the level of exploration we're still at. So how did I got into this, as I do most things in my life, by mistakes, because I'm a scientist. That's really how science proceeds, is you do something foolish and you come in the next morning and it's interesting and you pretend you did it on purpose. And if you look at the very early research, and there's a book out at the bookstore, or the books here that are for sale, called Theory of Microdosing by Thorsten Posse, and it's all about the really early research before anybody really understood anything. And there was serious agreement that there was no effects below 25 micrograms, which is true if you're looking for psychedelic effects. But then you don't say there's no effects. You say, here are the things I looked for that I didn't find. Science sometimes gets a little vague. And also in those early researchers, nobody was giving it intermittently. So nobody was seeing what the effects were over time. So our early results, and this was my saying to people like yourselves, why don't you try this and let me know how it goes? And many people like yourselves said, hey, sure, man. It ain't going to do much, but I'll give it a shot. And the early results were beneficial. And that's where we found the 2-day effect. That wasn't necessarily anything that was assumed. So I developed then this protocol of 2 days off, 1 day on, 2 days off. Well, why that third day? Well, if you're exploring, and we'll get to what exploring means, it's not research. When you're exploring, you want people to be able to both have an experience and not have it. and have it and not have it so they can tell the difference. So the third day, people were supposed to come down and be their normal, unmicrodosed self. So I would be looking for reports that say, oh man, I'm looking for that next dose day, because that would let me know they were down and up. Unfortunately for the researcher, after a month or so, people were beginning to fuzz out, and the third day was pretty good too. So that's science. And for some years, I was sure that 10 micrograms was what Hoffman had said. And then I found out from everyone who knew him that he never said that. That he'd taken personally like 20 to 50. And a month ago, someone wrote me and said, do you know there's a discussion in 2005, a day after Albert's 99th birthday, with a bunch of people chatting. And here is the dialogue. Albert, very, very low doses. This could be a worthwhile study. I've used it myself sometimes for walking and thinking. Rick Dobbin, head of MAPS. What kind of dose do you mean when you go walking? 25 micrograms. 25 instead of 125. Or even lower, 10. Yay! Rick. And I'm just dying to talk to Rick now that I read this. Wow. Can you actually notice when you take 10 micrograms? Can you even notice that you've taken it? Albert. Oh, yes. An improved response to nature. Improved experience of nature, yes. And thinking, a big improvement in thinking. And then he changes the subject. That's the background that I will eventually pretend I knew originally, instead of a month ago. So what's happening now, and as some of you have noticed, we're not waiting for the science. And microdosing is now incredibly out there in the culture. Articles in very mainstream places, LA Magazine, Marie Claire, Bust, which is for those of you that don't know, a kind of feminist power magazine. The Montreal Gazette, the Daily Mail. Many of the articles written by first-person accounts by the staff people, recounting an alleviation of their own long-standing mental and sometimes physical conditions. Now, how do you know you've made it into the culture? Microdosing was part of a comedy routine on Saturday Night Live. It was an answer to a question on NPR, wait, don't tell me. And it was asked about by a dog walker and an Uber driver. On the other side, Reddit has a little subtopic called microdosing. It has 70,000 members. And there's a YouTube article which looked at the most watched microdose YouTubes, and the top item was around 600,000 hits. And it's a kind of how do you microdose, and it's not bad. And here's a dark one. So you really know when the dark side is interested. Microdosing has even been considered as a possible tool to enhance military intelligence capability. This is in a journal for the Marine Corps. Now, some of you know that the CIA tried to make use of it for about 20 years and did just terrible, stupid research, but doesn't mean that they haven't thought about microdosing. Now, when I said we're exploring, I want to make clear that what we were doing is not research. We were doing search. Search is when you don't know what you're going to find. Research is when you're trying to set it up to prove what you know you're going to find. Which is why if you look at research carefully, always look at who they're excluding from the study. And that lets you know who might not do well. And since they're after what's called statistical certainty, they're working the numbers. It's not evil, but it is the way it's done. What we're doing, imagine you discover an island. You explore it. You say, gee, over there, there's trees. Some of them look like palm trees, only they're blue. Over here, there's some stuff in the stream that looks like crystals. And there's a little animal that hops along. And there's something in this flower. And when you suck the bottom of the flower, you really feel good. That's exploration. Or if you think of an unknown bit of rainforest where people go into it and come out with, 30 new species of something. Mapping comes first. Valuing, what's it for, what's it good for, how much should you take, can you make it into a synthetic, etc. That all is much, much later. Is it good for depression? Is it good for obesity? Is it good for acne? That's all later. That's research. And I have lots of friends who do it, so I don't have to. Because for me, the exploration is so much more fun, and that's when all the surprises happen. Now, I was doing this for a while, and people were writing me little diaries, little sets of drawings. For instance, a generally unknown use of microdosing. This is from a woman from Chicago. She said, for the first time, I didn't have the post-Burning Man depression. Okay? Which she was used to. So that's not yet been published. Except probably they know about it in Burning Man because they know everything. So I was accumulating, and then I also had someone who wrote 2,000 or 3,000 words a day. I know so much about his life and his divorce and his children. And he made wonderful discoveries that were very, very useful. But at some point, a friend of mine and an ex-student, Sophia Korb, entered and said, would you like to kind of make this a little more formal? Meaning, I'm a graduate of the program that you teach in, and I know you don't know much about research. So she suggested that we make a protocol that people could fill out on a daily basis, make a little checklist of what they were feeling each day, and then also write these reports. It's what we call citizen science, which is how science has always proceeded until PhDs were created. Darwin was an amateur. Galileo was an amateur, and so forth. So I want to go quickly through the more common reports from the first 700 people for which we have enough days of checklists and reports so that we're pretty clear about them. And I keep holding this cup thinking it's going to tip over, so I'm going to lay it down. If it tips over when I lay it down, please don't laugh. I appreciate that. So this is, I'm just going to go through these. Mood changes. What we had is people were checking 10 positive mood statements and 10 negative mood statements on a scale. How are you feeling today? Are you feeling sad today? Are you feeling ambitious today? Are you feeling effective today? Are you feeling excited today? Are you feeling depressed today, etc.? Overall, negative states went down. Now, this is similar to antidepressants. Negative states go down, but the difference is positive states went up, which is not true of antidepressants, and it's not true of practically anything. So that was the effect, and that is the fundamental effect that makes microdosing so interesting. Now, given that our particular sample was very heavy in people who either were clinically depressed, meaning someone had stamped that on their arm, or they just had depression now and then within the last month, 80% of them said they got a lot better. And the people who had the most depressed improved the most. Now, watch out, those of you in the science game, there's a trick in that. One of the reasons the most depressed people improved the most is they had the most to improve. They didn't improve more than the people who were slightly depressed who got to 0, and the people who were very depressed who got to 0 at the same place. So watch your science. How did people relate? And it was the question that came up in this ego inflation part of the last talk on why you should go to psychotherapy. Better able to remain centered. More comfortable with clients or colleagues or friends or children. Less social anxiety. That's a big one. That's different from general anxiety. General anxiety is everything bothers you and worries you. Social anxiety, you need other people before you feel bad. Less of that. And a wonderful college student said, I tested it. I went to Walmart late at night to shop. And I normally find it incredibly hard to make decisions. I keep my hoodie on, I don't make eye contact, and it's a terrible experience. She said, I went and I bought some things I needed, and I talked to people, and I was behaved just like a person. That's the difference in social anxiety. And also more tolerance and compassion, meaning people were better able to be with people they didn't want to be with and could feel compassion rather than, you piss me off. And that's a huge internal shift in orientation. Academic improvement, and the implications of this I hope to get to before I run out of time, but think about it. Higher test scores, better grades, better quality of attention, increased short-term memory. For example, this is from a report, recalling what was on a PowerPoint after a single brief glance. Okay, which means you could actually pay attention to what was going on rather than having to scramble back and forth between writing things down, looking at the PowerPoint, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another one, athletic improvement. Faster, untimed events. Improved reflexes, agility, strategy. Volleyball, for example, is a strategy game. And I remember one young man saying he was in college, volleyball, I think it was. Yeah, it was volleyball, not basketball. And what he said is, I don't know if I played any better, but I could feel very quickly what we were doing and was a much better player as part of a team. More awareness of the team's movements. And these reports in athletics are from college up to very high-level professional. These are people who, who do extremely well already. I mean, they're in the moneyed group of athletes, and they can tell the difference. At work, again, a remark from a young man who said, I only microdose when I have a coding problem. But also at work, increased success in sales calls, presentations, salary negotiation, better team effectiveness and problem solving. And most often what people report is I'm able to be in flow, in that timeless creative space, not better, not higher levels of creativity, but longer creativity. That's what they report. Now, the other thing is we were looking at, because those are all things that people kind of wanted. So when you're doing exploration on the island, you not only notice the flowers, but, oh, there's mushrooms under the flowers. What were some of the unintended changes that people had no particular interest in having? Eating habits. In almost every case, people have a healthier diet. And it's the usual less processed food, fresher organic, less junk food, etc. And from the report of a really wonderful, serious junk food eater, I looked at the menu, and by God, I wanted the salad. Caffeine, cannabis, alcohol. Now, I say this, and I'm now about to alienate terribly large, powerful forces in the culture that want to keep you sick and addicted. Microdosing, over and over, people reported less caffeine, less cannabis, and less alcohol. Now, these are not people wanting to give it up. We have a lot of that overcoming addiction, but this is just, us. And one of my favorites is procrastination. Usually, remarked on usually with surprise that it's no longer an issue. I stopped procrastinating and became more focused. And for a while I was worrying, because if you could cure procrastination, the pharmacology people will say, then we can make it a disease. And once it's a disease, you know what we do. And the other was libido. There's a quote, again, if it gets out how good this is for sex, you have a real product. Now, it's not clear, by the way, from the reports if the better sex described is a result of more sexual energy available or improved rapport and closeness. Those are very different, and both were often mentioned. Now, it's always necessary when you talk about any of these drugs that are not yet back to being what they should be, normal, you always are asked, well, what are the contraindications? If there isn't something bad about it, we won't believe you. We've struggled. The main group who don't do well with microdosing is people whose primary concern is anxiety. They report they are either more anxious or more aware of anxiety. They don't like it. The nice thing with microdosing, if you don't like it, stop. Depression, which almost always is linked to anxiety, because when you're depressed, you're anxious that your life isn't working because your life isn't working. That's fine. Depression works well. The only pharmaceutical that we have noted was lithium. Lithium is given when it's for very serious mental illness. And it's a very hard drug because like twice the dose that's good for you may kill you. So you have to really titrate it very carefully. We had one report of someone who microdosed was on lithium and had very bad experiences. So we put into our protocol, don't take it if you're on lithium. We then went through a couple of hundred cases and found a few more of people who were on lithium and it was okay. So we don't know. But we mention it because generally, if 1 out of 4, 5, or 6 people has a bad experience, that's a high number. So we recommend people who are on lithium not to microdose. Now, for the geeks in the audience, hands, never mind. Red-green blindness. People who have red-green color blindness, most of them report that they get tracers. Now, for the few of you who raised your hand, which you don't know about psychedelics, tracers are when you look at the nice light, and then you look over here, and the little light kind of follows you. You've seen it with sparklers on July 4th, that follow of light. They indicate that when you microdose, you get tracers. But unlike high doses, where the tracers go away when you come down, with microdosing, the tracers last a few days, and it's really not comfortable. So we recommend that people who have red-green blindness not do it. And when you're doing exploration, somebody writes in and said, I have red-green blindness and I'm microdosing and I have no problem. And someone else writes in and said, I have red-green blindness and I'm microdosing and yeah, there are tracers, but it's worth it. So we're looking at, again, a notion that this is an area of concern, and I'm hoping when I mention it that in some audience there is someone whose expertise is in the visual system, so they can say, wow, that's really interesting, and they can go find out what's going on. Because we don't stop anyone from taking it because people write us and say, I'm taking it. So we have people in our study that are not allowed in any psychedelic study. And I'll just give you one group, which is bipolar. Now, bipolar, by the way, is a crappy diagnosis, and there's lots more people that don't have it that are diagnosed of it. But real bipolar is you have a depressed time, you have a manic time. You have a depressed time, you have a manic time. And they're not allowed in any psychedelic studies because of what I mentioned earlier about you don't want people who might not work out for your study. But we can't stop them, so what we've learned is they figured out that if you microdose during the depressed phase, that's pretty good. If you microdose during the manic phase, you wouldn't do that. Okay? You know, when you have enough wood in the fire and the room is warm enough, you don't look for the gasoline can. But if it's really cold out, you build a fire. So what they've learned to do is to modulate their manic depressive cycles so they function better. And what Sophia particularly liked about that is the literature is full of saying they can't do that. They're unable to modulate their moods. And we say, well, they can't, but they plus microdosing seems to be helpful. And our comment to all the kind of serious researchers who then jump on us and say, well, how many people did it, and well, how old are they, and what was their weight, and what was their prior diagnosis? We say, do the research, don't bother us. You know, we're explorers. Here's this thing we found on the island. And I don't know, maybe this is an old one from some other island that fell on, I don't know. So what's happening with microdosing is that it's integrating into the culture in wonderfully kind of pleasant ways. And there's an article in The Guardian, English newspaper, on parenting with microdosing. Now, how many of you are parents? Okay. Ever get irritated? Like, I'd like to crush your little skull, but I'm not going to say that aloud. Parents discover in themselves an amazing amount of this unhappy side. We all know it. According to the article in The Guardian, quoting a number of parents, it makes parenting just a lot easier. So you microdose, and then the kids don't bother you, and therefore they're not as difficult, and the whole thing works better. And my favorite of the trivialization of something that you can use for treatment-resistant depression of 30 years is first dates. Article on microdosing on first dates. You know what a first date's like. Yeah. I want it to work. I want it not to work. I want to really understand the other person. I really want to like them. I don't want to be snowed. All that. The writer said that she's in college, and the rest of the article is about people on first dates. But her story is, I love it. I'm invited to sex parties. And I've gone to 3 sex parties, and I haven't met anyone. Now, she said, it might be because I don't smoke dope and I don't drink. And I thought, maybe. She said, but then I microdosed. And I had my first hookup. Do not tell your teenage kids about this. And there are now microdose kits. One comes in a beautiful wooden box. Guy in England makes them. Now, how much kit does it take to take a mushroom and break off a piece? I don't know, but don't ever underestimate the possibility of entrepreneurs to make something into something you could sell. There's also microdosing classes. There's also, this is now just from Holland, microdosing coaches. So, and I'm more and more starting to look at Reddit, particularly since I put the app on and it suddenly learned what I was interested in. And this wonderful comment somewhere last week. One of the reasons I don't use PowerPoints is stuff happens too soon, too close to what we're doing. LSD or shrooms will not heal you if you don't do the work together with it. I've been microdosing LSD for 6 to 7 months, and I can tell you that all the areas in my life are improved just because I wanted to improve. Don't see it as a magic pill, see it as your mentor. Now, that's easier to say with ayahuasca, because ayahuasca says, I told you that. Remember, you were in that session, and you asked, and I told you, da-da-da-da-da-da. A friend of mine with his first ayahuasca session, he was a yoga teacher, and ayahuasca says, stop teaching yoga. He said, what? And he wrote me the dialogue. It was a little argument. Ayahuasca said, I said not to teach yoga, I really meant it. And so he had a session, and he thought, it's a plant from South America, what does it know about yoga? So he teaches his yoga class, and he gets sick. And after about 5 classes where he gets sick every time, he calls me. Now, this is not hard therapy to do. And he said, I said, what did ayahuasca say? It said, I shouldn't do therapy. Have you found that doing yoga is working for you? He says, no. I said, I'm not going to really, make a psychodynamic discussion about this. But if you keep putting your finger in the fire and it gets burned every time, eventually you're supposed to learn. So he doesn't teach yoga. Now, as microdosing becomes part of the culture, what are some of the disruptions that may occur? Disruption, I live in Silicon Valley, and the word disruption has like a glow around it. Disruption equals $1 billion personal wealth if you can disrupt something. Like Uber. Uber makes billions. It only loses $1 billion a year, but it really disrupts. So you overlook that it doesn't work really well. Professional sports. If microdosing with psychedelics improves performance in a variety of reports, whether it's allowed, monitored, or banned, it will be used. Professional sports is really clear about illegal drugs, legal drugs, any kind of drugs, we use them. And I think, and I'm not totally sure, but at the level of microdosing, particularly if you wait a few hours, and some psychedelics, by the way, are legal in a number of countries. We don't live in one, but there's a lot of other countries a little ahead of us. Probably nothing is measurable with the current anti-doping testing. So here's a substance which improves speed, coordination, etc., and it's not testable. Don't quote me. And here's my favorite quote on that. I've gone from getting consistently silver medals to getting nothing but gold medals for the past year. This is a jiu-jitsu guy, and the reason I doubly like it is the headline of the article. Pro jiu-jitsu fighter says LSD helps him whoop ass. That's science. The article did not give his real name. Now, let's take another area that, after all, professional sports is also a kind of entertainment. And, we're willing to have sports that have an incredible injury rate if it amuses us. So professional sports is its own world. Education's a little different. Where students compete against each other, substance use is already an issue. So-called cognitive enhancers are the second most used illegal drug on many college campuses, marijuana being first. Now, put your hand up really fast and put it down fast. How many of you used off-label Adderall, Provigil, one of those? Hands, please. Whoosh, whoosh. Okay, it's a little windy in here. Microdoses are even more enticing. They're reported, as I've said, to improve those attributes, the same as cognitive enhancers, and you don't become addicted. Okay? And you don't crash. If you think about it, in courses and exams graded on a curve, and some of you may be in that right now, students of equal capacity without access to microdoses will be at a measurable disadvantage competing with students who are microdosing. That's cultural disruption. Okay? Now, I'm old enough to know when people started to be able to use calculators, hand calculators, before we had smartphones and so forth, in exams. And I was at Stanford at the time in an engineering department. It was a huge fight. What was allowed? Because they were about a $500 item then. Okay, and it was clear that it was discrimination based on money. And should you allow it or not allow it, if you were allowing it for homework and so forth and so on. Disruptions in education get very serious. Now, imagine that there are some examinations which are career determining. They're critical, they're proctored, they're timed, and except if you go to SC and you throw in another $500,000, they're competitive. Which for 99% of us, they are. But they determine the acceptance and placement in graduate programs as well, in law, medicine, computer science, and so forth. If you're taking the law school exam, people who microdose will have an advantage. And let us, since I've now got the alcohol and the cannabis and the caffeine people about to get me, let's not leave psychopharmacology out of it. Psychedelics, even at microdose levels, are often more effective with treatment-resistant populations than current medications. That's a kind of slightly technical way of saying what you understand is, particularly the word treatment-resistant, which is a term I really hate because it sounds like it's your fault. He's resisting. No, you gave him crap. Oh! Lots of our reports are people using microdoses to taper off antidepressants. The tragedy of antidepressants is if they work or they don't work, you can't get off them without what's called tapering. The word withdrawal does not appear, oddly enough, in the pharmacology literature. But they do use the term tapering, and it's a good one. And it takes a long time, and people report that microdosing may make it go more quickly, but it makes it go more easily. And not only for antidepressants. What's the other big drug, which we talked about for education? Cognitive enhancers. Adderall, Ritalin, Provigil. Again, we have multiple reports of people coming off of those. There's a New York Times reporter who is doing a book about attention and also about psychedelics, but I read a long earlier article about her own Adderall addiction and how bad it got and how she would go 80 miles, at night in New Hampshire during a storm to a place that would give her a prescription. People are using microdoses to get off of these severely addictive drugs. If something is cheaper, better, faster, and less side effects, where I come from, that's called disruption. And not to make it even harder for me to ever be invited to regular conferences, even of my psychedelic friends, a remarkable possibility has occurred, and it's a study done out of the University of Maastricht in Holland. First author is Nadia Hutton, and I'll give you the longish, boring way of doing an article, and then I'll tell you what it said. self-related effectiveness of microdosing with psychedelics for mental and physical health problems among microdosers. What that said is they asked thousands of people kind of signed in for the survey, and they pulled it down to people who microdosed and had a series of either mental or physical problems. And they basically said, did microdosing affect your condition? And the effects were, and I love these questions, did it work? Different question. Did the symptoms disappear? Third question. Quality of life improved. Now, they also asked, had you had conventional treatment for whatever it is we're talking about? And there's a whole list of conditions. Same questions. And then, have you tried full doses? Same questions. And what they found was that if you kind of imagine 3 bars here, and here is microdoses, here's conventional treatment, and here is full dose. In almost every case, this is looked just at mental conditions, full dose was more effective than microdose, but both of them were almost twice as effective as conventional treatment. Okay? I agree. This is a shattering study. And I just had a wonderful discussion, we'll call it a discussion last night, with some of the other people on the program about the implications of, let us say, we're talking about depression. There's a great study in England. They had, I think, 10 subjects, and people had no depression for 6 weeks to 6 months. Now, what was the cost per person of that study? The 2 staff, the medical tests, the overhead for the location, the follow-up, and so forth, versus the same, perhaps, percentage of improvement, a little less, with microdosing, about $10. There's something to be looked at that situation, where we have high doses and low doses, both considerably better than conventional treatment, and high doses better. But better, at least statistically, meaning if you have enough people. Individuals, you have to see for yourself. I think that is probably that disturbs the psychedelic community, who are at the moment so smug. You know, I mean, Johns Hopkins just got $17 million to do whatever they want. That's about 5 years worth of work. There's stuff coming out of Yale and UCLA, and I'm talking to people at Columbia that want to do a microdose study, and there are people in New Zealand doing these studies, and high dose, low dose, etc. So we're going to actually be seeing not conventional versus microdose, but conventional versus microdose versus high dose. Kind of exciting, at least for people like me. Now, what are the future directions? Well, kind of focus studies. Back to the island. You know, here's a fruit. I wonder if it'll grow in Virginia or Montana or Maine because it's a delicious fruit and we don't have it. But we know it grows on the island. Cluster headaches. Cluster headaches, for those of you that don't know, they're the worst pain known to human beings. Okay? Just without any discussion. And average time between diagnosis and first effective treatment, and there aren't very many that are effective, is about 8 years. It's also called suicide headaches, because people, if they're quote episodic, you know when the next ones will be coming. Just imagine if you could put on your calendar, in 3¼ months, I will suffer the worst pain known to human beings. They're called suicide headaches, because people will kill themselves rather than do it again. And somebody who was tripping, his calendar said it was time to suffer, and he didn't. So he started investigating the possibility that LSD in this case, affected clusters. And high doses almost always help clusters. But there's a study now in Holland using microdoses, and in our research we have, usually when people ask us, we say, go to the high dose site and look at what they have. But some people write us and say, I've been microdosing and my clusters went away. So it's an area of serious research. ADHD, very serious research, and ADD, all those are being now looked at with tight research studies for microdosing. And since I can't wait, see, if you get old enough, you just don't want to wait a long time. So I looked ADD up on Reddit. Out of the 70,000 people, not surprisingly, there's some little discussions of that. And the answer is, it seems to help some people and it doesn't help others. Well, in my world, what that means is, I want to distinguish who those two groups are so we can give it to these people. The other part of the future, and you know what happened with marijuana when this happened, the venture funds are at the gate. The startups are coming. The money is in motion. There's a company that's tried to put a squeeze on the synthesis of psilocybin, like to control the flow of psilocybin to other researchers. There's a company called the Field Trips Venture Fund. And they say the next frontier is psychedelics. Now, when they say the next frontier, these are mainly people who've made an enormous amount of money very quickly by investing in marijuana stocks. There's a lab in Jamaica looking at new versions of how to work with mushrooms. And there's other things happening in the mental drug world. My favorite is actually someone is trying to develop an alcohol-like experience when you drink it, but without the physical after effects. How's that? And the person who's doing it was a former British drug czar who was fired for doing an article that showed that fox hunting was more dangerous than psychedelics. You don't do that in England. There's several companies that are busy making drugs, when they say with the same effects, meaning physiological effects, but without mental experiences. Ibogaine without reviving memories. Ayahuasca with just purging. Whoa, a big seller. As you can tell, I'm not enthused for that particular line of research, which says the mental experiences, we can eliminate those. I just hope they leave sex alone. And I have had calls, and my favorite said it very cleanly. He says, what are the good investment opportunities in the psychedelic space? That's a venture capital talk. And what happened, as you noticed with marijuana, is a lot of positive things, which is it's much more widely available and so forth and so on, and a lot of things that happen when money moves, which is you crush small producers and so forth and so on. But the difference is, in our country, if you want legislation in your favor and you go to Washington, you buy it. It's called lobbying. It's also called all the crooked under-the-counter gifts and all that, but it's basically, you can't now pass anti-marijuana legislation because the lobbyists will down your throat. And they just say very simply, do you want to get reelected? Because we know you're such a good person and bribable? Or are we going to bring in someone who's even worse than you and bribable? It's a very, legislators have that problem. It's a genuine problem. If they're really good, decent people, they have the same pressures to knuckle under to lobbyists as people who are really crumbs. But marijuana moved forward possibly because all that money suddenly was in lobbying. Will it happen in psychedelics? Someone said, are you disturbed with what's going to happen? I said, no, it'll be terrible. Recovery from terrible is usually a pretty good thing. There's other things happening. Now again, let's go back to ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is made of 2 plants. You can now buy, legally, United States, Amazon, Banisteriopsis caapi. That's the vine. It's a group, I think it's called Soul of the Vine. It's got a Facebook page. And the reports that I read on that page read like microdosing. There's another company called Soul Drops, S-O-U-L. And they say we do a kind of distillation, a very elegant kind of distillation, with sister plants. Now, one of their products is called Cosmos, and it says it increases your dream life. It does. Now, personally, I had incredibly long dreams. Boring dreams. It's kind of like you're in traffic going into Portland to work in the morning. On your right and left, there are cars. After a while, you're closer to the city. So I stopped it, but other people have better dreams. Amanita muscaria, the one that we see on all the Christmas decorations and what Santa Claus dresses up like. There's some work coming out of Russia that looks very interesting. So we're beginning also, remember, microdosing cannabis. There's a company that just raised $5 million because it develops methods of getting drugs into your system faster. Now, some of you, and I don't want your hands. Actually, this is Oregon. I can ask your hands. Edibles, hands, please. Okay. What's the problem with edibles? Yeah, it takes a long time. Would you like a product that goes under your tongue and is in 5 minutes the equivalent of your edible? Yeah, well, they're working on it. And just as a little far out, nobody's even looking at this yet, but I came across some remarks of Andy Weil about cocaine. Comment, this is Andy quoting, "The bitter leaf contains the highest percentage of the cocaine alkaloid. Another 13 components are in the leaf as well. It's unfortunate that only the so-called active principle cocaine has received all the attention. The other substances working in combination with each other have an entirely different effect, very likely providing a kind of pharmacological insulation that ensures against the misuse of the isolated cocaine alkaloid." So at your local dispensary in a couple of years, Andy's Coke. And just keep in mind, peyote, mescaline, has 39 other alkaloids. We've analyzed 4 of them. Okay? The nice thing about ayahuasca is you're getting real plants, but as you know, you can also make, quote, synthetic ayahuasca. But you don't get grandmother with it. So that's a little bit of what I'm doing. And in terms of contemporary, I was kind of lying around this morning and Reddit said, "Hey, look at this." So I looked. And someone said, "Which do you like better, LSD or shrooms?" Now, that's like asking, wine people about wine. And so after 50 responses, the answer was some people like one, some people like the other, and everyone has a theory about differences. But that's a kind of, this was all in the microdosing world. So we're looking at subtler and subtler differences as we leave the island, taking with us these big baskets. My daughter, who's an ethnobotanist, when she's in the rainforest, she carries a plant press, which means you put a plant in it and you squash it, and it dries squashed. But you can then bring it out, and then you can do whatever ethnobotanists do to discover what's in it and so forth. We're now leaving the island of discovery of microdosing, and we are entering the world that you were all in, and thank you for letting me share that with you. Now, the one nice thing about being last is I probably still can get in some questions, but I warn you, I think a question is defined as follows. Some of you know this. It's a single sentence. It may have a clause or two, but short ones, and it ends with your voice going up a little. And it never begins with, I have to tell you about my trip. So, genuine questions, please. And you have a mic, and the microphone and the sound in here is so good that even though my hearing is less good, it's probably going to work.
Okay. Sorry. With your 1 day on, 2 day off, do you recommend that ongoingly, or do you say after a few months to take a break, or?
Well, we really don't know, but I can tell you what a couple of thousand people have told us. That after a month of doing it that way, most people take it less often. They take it once a week, they take it on special occasions. Very few people make it every other day. And that's what we're hearing. So I can't really answer what's right. Now, we had people who were doing it for over 100 days. I mean, still giving us data. We only asked for 30. And the little group, and Sophia called me once, and she said, our little group at the long haul people, the long tail people, suddenly around 100 days, their emotional life seems to get very wobbly. So since we're explorers, she said, so I said, what are you going to do? She said, well, I wrote them. Because we don't know who they are, but we wrote them and said, we don't know who you are, what's up? That particular group, this is not a nice story. We're all dying. Different reasons. Terrible conditions. And microdosing was helping them. It wasn't helping them maybe live longer, maybe, but it was helping them have a better quality of life. They were taking it pretty much still 1 day on, 2 days off. So that's as good as I can give you.
Is it my imagination, or after microdosing for a while, when you stop, have you noticed in your exploring that your level does not drop as it does with pharmaceutical antidepressants?
Oh, okay. So the question is, after you've microdosed for a while, see, I think, does your system maintain? Or, as with a pharmaceutical, do you go into serious trouble if nobody tapers off microdosing. It's too little. It's kind of like tapering off, one bit of egg. For many people, I think the reason they take it less often is they feel there's no need. I do have an incredibly wonderful study from a woman, originally Chinese lawyer, who's now living in Holland, having gotten a PhD, and she just sent a report that is better than anything in our files. And she indicated after a couple of months of microdosing, she had a week or two which had difficulty. And then her system seemed to go back up to where it had been pretty much during microdosing. And since one of her determinants was joy, it's one of her variables, she felt it was very measurable. So the answer is, it depends on the individual, and the reason we only ask for a month, that's a research question. It's not about that we know enough to say that's enough. So the question really is, when does it feel correct for you? And of course it's a good idea to stop anything now and then and see what your system is. I've been working recently with a naturopath for some health issues of my own, and she said, what I've learned is you ask people what's their favorite food, one which if you said stop taking it, they would be mad at you. That's one you have to give up. And I got mad at her. And she was right. So So even something that's working wonderfully, take some time off and see whether it's still useful. That's a really good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, forgive me if you already said this, but have there been studies comparing the effectiveness of microdosing versus macrodosing of psilocybin in terms of long-term benefits?
Long-term benefits is tricky for the high-dose people because they don't follow up very long. In fact, serious question, how many of you have used a pharmaceutical like an antidepressant longer than 6 months? Do you know how much research there is about the effects of what you're taking after 6 months? Almost zero. Yeah, well, you're supposed to take it for 20 years, says my doctor. What's the data on its effects? Well, the pharmaceutical companies stopped checking after it did 6-month studies. So we're in a real hole. We're now starting some 2-year follow-ups because we have people who we can locate, and we know what happened to them in the first month. Macrodoses, if you don't integrate what you've learned, then you'll revert back to prior habits. Very simply, if you're an alcoholic and you have a macrodose, and in the macrodose your body says, do you know what you've been doing? Do you know what we do after a while to you? We stop functioning. We, the liver, just stop. And you say, oh, really? I think if I stop, will you recover? It says, yeah, we'll do the best we can. And I know people who've had 1 dose and they never drank again. And I know people who said, man, that was an incredible trip. And my body had this incredible thing to say, and I celebrated. Okay? So with a high dose, the question is, can you integrate what you've learned? See, microdoses, you are integrating what you've learned, and you also may be, we don't know, you are extending neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is a cool word meaning your brain grows new stuff. And one definition of a psychedelic that my youngest colleague, he was still an undergraduate when we did a paper together, he really uses the term beautifully. Psychedelics are an accelerator of neuroplasticity. So they allow you to lay down new brain patterns, high doses, very quickly. But think of it like an armature. You then have to fill in the armature to make it last. So your question is probably more of an individual answer than a research answer.
Dr. Fadiman, I wonder if you can say whether any of these studies included the synthetic LSDs such as 1P LSD? Do you know if anybody is using...
1P LSD turns into LSD in the body, just like, remember, psilocybin turns into psilocybin? I don't know why the body just can't take it the way it is. 1P LSD, ALD52, and I remember one or two others, turn into LSD in the body. As far as we can tell, we can't tell the difference. Now, the reason we know, and we have a number of people with 1P LSD, is some grown-up countries, like Canada, don't make things illegal until they exist. We make things illegal, actually, that don't yet exist. It's called the Analog Act. But you can buy 1P LSD through mail order in Canada. And I talked to a journalist in Canada once who wanted to do an article, and I said, why don't you just try to get some 1P LSD? And she wrote me a week later and said, came in the mail. So as far as we know, see, LSD is a semi-synthetic. 1P is probably also a semi-synthetic. I'm not an organic chemist. As long as the molecule seems to turn into LSD in the body says, looks like LSD to me. So yes, the synthetics, the other drugs seem to work fine. And remember, all the psilocybin in all that research that we like so much, that's all synthetic. And mushrooms have other alkaloids, so it might be that real mushrooms were designed by someone, even smarter than people with PhDs from Harvard and Yale and all those places. And those other alkaloids are in there for a reason. Could be. Yes, please. One more question, perhaps.
I'm wondering, what can we do to avoid the profit-based commodification of the psychedelic experience? And should we avoid something like that?
Remember Facebook? It's free. Okay? The question is, can we avoid a commodification? Sure. However, the product that people will make money on is called grow kits, where you can make your own mushrooms at home. That will take you out of the profit world. Will there be commodification, and can we stop it? I doubt it. Someone sent me an article today which basically is it's a description of another kind of story of someone who develops wonderful psychedelics and wonderful clinics and is generous and good and kind and slowly loses control of the company. And, you know, the bad people come in and make 10 times as much money and commodify it and cheapen it and make it worse. And the person commenting on it said, is that worse than not having it available? And I haven't read the story. It's done as a story. And I think it's a story told from the point of view that it's going to happen and it'll be bad. My own guess is it's going to happen and some of it will be bad. Remember, those of you who had coffee this morning, how many of you had Folgers coffee? That's commodification. Okay? Now, did any of you have organic fungus-free coffee? Okay, that's the other end. How many of you drink Gallo wine? Okay? But there's this little French, little tiny vineyards all over Oregon and so forth. So I think that human goodness and commodification may not exist in the same space, but they exist in the same ecospace. And that is as close to profound as I'm going to get, so let's call it a day. And I just have to thank all the people that made this possible, which is all of you, and I have to thank all of you for making the state of Oregon hopefully the world's leader in restoring plants to their proper place.